Hi, I'm really excited to be here. My name is Divya Sasidharan, and I am a web developer currently based out of Chicago. I work at a small startup where I work on the front end for a financial modeling app that is geared towards helping real estate investors with their underwriting. And you can find me on the interwebs at ShortDiv. Very recently, a little over a year ago, I made the transition from React to Vue. The transition, like most transitions of technologies, happened because I was looking for a new job and subsequently transitioned to a new job. But I like to convince myself that I learned Vue because I was motivated enough to learn a new framework, and thus began my immersion into this new framework, into the Wild West. And in my approach, I tried to learn Vue with a completely open mindset. I didn't want to bring in my preconceptions and opinions of what I felt a front-end framework should be. And I was pretty successful with this approach. I took a methodic approach of learning things from scratch, and within a week, I was up and running and productive in Vue. But after that point, maybe a month or so when I was comfortable, I found that I was struggling to translate specific concepts that I had been used to in React. A lot of the complex interactions and functionalities, like context, I wasn't understanding how exactly to translate that into Vue. And so I decided to take a step back and reassess how I was approaching my learning. And I realized that my approach of coming from a React background wasn't necessarily a bad thing. I was just asking the wrong questions. I was approaching Vue from React, trying to make Vue like React, even though Vue was definitely not like React. And so what I ended up doing is just adopting the way I learn things, which is hacking it till I make it. And so I took React concepts that I was familiar with, hacked it, and brute forced my way so that Vue would do it similarly, and then took a step back and reassessed that and asked myself how I could do that in a better way that's more declarative and Vue-like. And so this talk is an inspiration of that process. It's a lot less messy and frustrating. And since we're approaching Vue from a React point of view, we'll be using popular concepts and techniques that you may have used if you worked with React to drive this exploration. I'm going to start by talking about components and how both React and Vue handle and implement componentization. Then I'm going to talk about rendering children components. Then we'll move on to rendering props, or taking in a function as a property. And then lastly, which is my favorite part of this talk, is rendering non-HTML. Componentization is a central concept in front-end development. When we build an application, it's hard not to think in terms of components. Though we have a sense of the big picture, we design and implement in isolation or in features. Stephen Hay mentions this in his book, Responsive Design Workflow, where he breaks down the process of designing and building responsively. He mentions that there was a shift in the way that we build things, so we no longer build monolith web applications or websites, but we build responsively and progressively in components. So I'd like you to sit with this concept and think of it in the context of a cup of tea. A cup of tea, there's nothing as simple as a cup of tea, if you're familiar with the phrase. But if we think about it, even something as basic as this can be broken down into its constituent layers. Tea consists of tea leaves, milk, if you so choose, and water. And as front-end developers, we can represent that using markup. We can create different components and represent them like so. And if we were to implement this in React, it's fairly straightforward. We could create a class. It extends from React.component. And then we'll instantiate that component with props. And then in the render method, we'll return the desired markup, which in this case will be a single div with an ID of t. Vue is obviously very different in its syntax. For starters, we are not using JavaScript, and we're not writing HTML using JavaScript. We separate our logic from our templates. And so in our templates, we return a single div with an ID of t. And in our JavaScript, we instantiate our view with a name of t. And that's pretty much how you would do componentization in Vue and React. And so this example so far is fairly simplistic. It's not clear to us the intricacies and differences between both frameworks. And so let's try to add some logic so that we can tease apart how different they implement components. So on occasion, I take my tea with sugar, and it depends on my mood. Sometimes I take it with 2 sugars, sometimes I take it with 1, and sometimes none at all. And visually, I'm representing that using spoons. If I were to do that in React, I can do so because React allows us to represent multiple repetitive components using a map function. Sugar is, of course, a number because it's 2 or 1 or 0. So I have to create an empty array, which gives me access to that map method, which I can then use to create repetitive elements in React. In Vue, you can do something very similar, except we're going to use a directive, a v4. And a v4 essentially allows us to do the same thing, where we can pass in the specific array or number, and Vue knows the number, like how many components exactly to render. And so, as you can tell, you're starting to see that when we think about Vue, we're thinking about templates and how things look on a screen, and then adding logic to it, versus in React, where we're doing both at the same time. So we're in New Orleans. It's pretty hot and humid here, and people drink their tea cold. So how do we represent that? We want to have a difference. We want to add additional display to show hot and cold. And so we want to be able to have an element, a hot element and a cold element. In my example, I'm using hot, a representation of hot is steam, and a representation of cold is icicles, because I wanted them to be similar in a sense. And so in React, if I wanted to do that, if I had 2 components, I can use a ternary function, and based on the Boolean value of that ternary function, which in this case is a prop of is iced, it will give me whether to render the cold element or the hot element. And in Vue, you can do the same, except we use a directive again, or a binding, a vif binding, and we're just telling Vue which components to render. So Vue knows exactly what to show. And so if we put all of that together, again, we're noticing that in Vue, the way that we write our code is very declarative. We're telling Vue, and we're very particular about how something looks, and then we add logic on top of it. So there's a clear separation of concerns, and there isn't the cognitive load of having to remember everything and add logic to your components as you're creating the markup. And this is, of course, all of what it looks like in JSX. And it's a little bit difficult to read because the logic, as I said, is in the markup itself. So, this is so small. So this is a representation of that, all the components together. And if I were to look at that in the Vue developer tools, I can see that all of the different components are rendered. And I can even change the property so that it gives me different components. So you see icicles versus not, because never mind. It's hard to see the other side. But yeah, I changed the Boolean value, and then it updates the template exactly as I intended to. Perfect. But you also notice now that what's happening is we've only dealt with components in isolation. Neither milk, nor water, nor tea have access to a parent element, nor children should they have any. They don't even know if each other exists. And this is not how most of us build applications. We build things with nested components where we pass state or we pass props. And so we need components to know about each other or about parent elements. So we're going to talk about render children now, because that's a concept that allows you to do that. So think about this. We're going to go back to this analogy. It's a long-winded analogy, so bear with this. If you have a friend who joins you for a cup of tea, there's 2 cups of tea now, except you and your friend are very different. Maybe you're more of a Darjeeling person, and they're more of an Earl Grey person, and so you don't want the same type of tea. Or maybe they're more of a purist, and they insist that milk be poured in the cup before tea added, and you the reverse. And so you want the order to be different. And with the way that we've built things so far, tea is always on the bottom, followed by milk, followed by water. And that's not very declarative, because cup always has to determine and know how exactly to render the children. So you want cup to actually have no concept of its children and just to render them. So that's what render children, that's what we're going to do. We're going to create a cup, and then within that it has a bunch of children. But cup itself doesn't have to know about its children. It just needs to know to render those children. And so if we refactor the code we had in React, we would just use this.props.children because that's a way to access children, and React knows to render them. And if you're familiar with JSX, you'll know that JSX is just an abstraction or sugar syntax over React.createElement. React.createElement takes in 3 properties. It takes in a HTML element, which is a div in this case. It takes in some properties, which is an ID in this case. And then it takes in children as its last argument. Vue is also nice in the sense that we have access to this render method. And Greg mentioned that in his talk yesterday, and even Chris did, where we ourselves can render and tell Vue what exactly to render and how. And so we're going to use that for this to explain how to render children. We're going to use not React.create. We're going to use createElement because this is not React. And then and createElement works the same as React because it takes in this exact same 3 arguments, except that children are not a props in Vue. You can use this.$options to grab children, or you can use this.$slots.default to grab children. Also possible options. And if you wanted to go one step further and really brute force your way into Vue, you can even use JSX, using the Vue JSX transform plugin. And so you can just render children that way, which is pretty nice. And here is an example of what that looks like. So we have our cup element, and previously we had all of the children just sitting within them, but now we have, I called it carafe, but it's a cup. It's the same thing. And so you have water and tea and no milk because I probably changed that earlier. Milk is a functional component. But anyway, so we have the concept of a parent element and children within them, which is perfect because now cup or carafe doesn't have to know about its children. It just needs to know to render them, and that's what we see in the Vue dev tools. Perfect. Except this is not very Vue-like. This is very React-y. And I come from a React background, and so this feels familiar to me. But if you've never done React and you've only done Vue, you'll know that this is not how Vue tells you to render your templates. You're supposed to separate your logic from your templates. But the thing is, if this slide gives you any indication, you can just use a slot, and you save yourself maybe 6 lines of code, instead of having to wrangle through JSX or having to understand the arguments that createElement takes. You can just create a slot, and the cup element knows exactly how to render its children. And you can go one step further. If you insist that tea is on the bottom always, despite your friend insisting that milk goes on the bottom, you can do that. You can be the benevolent dictator, and using named slots, you can insist that tea is on the bottom. And so even though someone might create a cup and slot in milk and tea, despite milk being below tea, when you render it, tea will always be on the bottom. So that's a really cool thing about named slots, because you can organize your content if you so choose to. So render props is a really common and famous technique in React. It picked up maybe a year or so ago. And the idea of a render prop is a function prop that a component uses to know what to render. Generally, a render prop involves rendering a regular component with a function as a prop that can be used to share state. So, as I said previously, components are primary units of code reuse, but it's not always obvious how state can be shared from parent to child or from child to parent. And so we'll again return to this cup of tea example, except this is a pretty fancy way of drinking tea. I never drink tea this way ever. I usually drink tea this way in a to-go cup because I'm too busy to have to have a saucer and a teacup in hand. And so the way that we have our element now is we have a cup and it contains those liquids. If I want it to be in a to-go cup, I could just create a to-go cup and that will be done. But the issue again is that I have to always declare the container in which that liquid has to exist. There isn't a default where a default container, so I don't always have to tell the component how exactly to render. So what we want to move towards is a way of having an order component, perhaps. So unless I tell the barista or whoever's making my tea to put it in a to-go cup, they're always going to put it in a teacup and saucer, because that's how tea should be drunk. So we'll create our order component, and then we'll add a slot to it. We'll call that slot drink. And then within that slot, we'll render our cup element. And this cup element has all of those tea components. And so if you don't pass anything to order, it will always render cup. And the other nice thing about slots is that you can pass props down. Remember how we talked about the fact that the idea of render props is being able to share state? So this is a key part of this feature, because you can pass the temperature prop from the order component down to its children. So I have order, and if what I told you is any indication, this will give you a cup. And if I put a scope template, where I pass in the to-go cup, that's what it will give me, a to-go cup instead of a cup. So that's pretty much what we have here. We have a to-go cup, and we have a temperature of its contents. The idea behind the number below it is just the temperature at which the beverage is, and it's supposed to show you that parent state is passing it down to its child, but parent is also updating its state, and child is also able to understand that change as it happens. And so there's a message currently that says, cautions, contents may be hot because it is a hot beverage. But if I were to update the temperature down to maybe 20 degrees, which is very cold, the caution contents no longer exist. So that's just a way of showing you that the child is able to listen to that parent change and update accordingly. Rendering null, my favorite part. So far we've talked about rendering actual HTML, so components always have markup and always have a way of, you always have a way of looking at it in the DOM. But that's not always the case. Not every use case is as explicit as that. And one example is maps. Has anyone worked with maps before? Yes, cool. So modern web maps, if you've worked with them, you're familiar, render to canvas. They're WebGL elements, and canvas elements are a single component, which means that you can't use a lot of the declarative things that Vue offers, because there is no declarative templates. But we can cheat. So the idea behind maps is that maps has multiple layers. Just think about it. There's always a base map. It's like a bitmap or an image map. And then on top of it, you have maybe a land use layer. You might have a roads layer. You might have a parks layer, maybe transit, and so on. And all of those layers add context and meaning to that map. So it makes it useful to you as a user. And we're going to use Mapbox for this example. I won't go into details on the specific intricacies of Mapbox. They have wonderful documentation. So if you're interested, go check that out. But what we're doing is we're just instantiating a simple map object. And then Mapbox gives you an onload function in which you can add sources and layers and interactivity, because a map that's static is pretty boring. This might work. Hooray. So that's what it looks like. When you create a basic map object, it gives you a map of New Orleans in this case, and you can interact with it, you can zoom, you can do whatever else you need to do with it. And in Vue, if we want to grab all of that code, we can. We can create a base map component, and then we will throw all of that Mapbox instantiation code into the mounted hook. And then, of course, we have to tie it into a DOM node, so we'll create a single div with an ID of base map, and then the reference is important because it allows Mapbox to know exactly where to hook itself to. But the thing that we have, the problem we face now is that base map, even though we managed to componentize and grab all of that logic into one place, the map is not reusable. Currently, the map is of New Orleans, But let's say you want to show a map of DC or a map of Chicago. You can't do that because base map is hard-coded within itself. You could, if you wanted to, add props so that the map can be configurable. You can change the longitude, latitude, you can change the zoom, you can change like the ID. But again, you're faced with an issue because maps have additional layers added to them. You're always adding a source, you're always adding a layer, and so that is hard-coded into that base map component, and there's no way of abstracting that logic away because it's still within that base map object. So what we want to move towards is something like this. We want to make it more declarative, so it's easy for us developers to think about maps in terms of layers, which is how they're built. We want to create a parent base map object, and then maybe a couple of children. We would want a source layer, maybe a feature layer, and a pop-up, because what's a map without pop-ups? So we're going to literally put Vue on the map as an example. And this is what we're moving towards. We want a base map with a single feature layer. So let's use what we learned earlier about slots, and let's create a slot into our base map so that base map is able to render its children. And now we can move on to feature layer. And feature layer, this might be a bit uncomfortable for a lot of you because it renders null. There's no HTML associated with it. But don't worry, you're still doing stuff and adding things to a map. So in mounted, we're going to grab all of those add layer and add source things and just dump it into mounted. But again, we're faced with an issue. There's so many issues in this. But map, because we teased apart the logic of add layer and base map, feature layer no longer has access to the map context. It doesn't know what map is. And so what we'll do is we're going to pass the context from the base map to its children. And Mapbox gives you the onloaded hook that I mentioned. And within that onloaded hook, you can grab the map object, and then you can pass that down through the slot to the child. And so this is a slot scope, and then we'll have feature layer be within that slot scope, and then we can pass that down to the child. But then again, like, it doesn't work because map context is trying to add itself, but map context is still undefined, and that's because base map and feature layer are trying to render at the same time. And that's an issue because you can't add a layer unless a map exists. A map needs to exist before a layer exists. And so what we'll do is we'll add another data property in base map called loaded, and loaded will basically change itself from true to false, or false to true, or null to true in this case, and then pass that on to its child element. And so feature layer is able to use the v-if binding, and if loaded is true, it can then render itself, and the map context will be passed down appropriately. So you will have Vue on a map. But again, a map is not very interesting without interactivity, so let's add a pop-up to it. So we're going to have one layer deeper, one extra nested layer deeper. We have base map with a feature layer child. And then within that feature layer, we're going to add feature pop-up because the pop-up is associated with that layer element. And so we will just slot in feature pop-up into feature layer, and then we will create a slot. And I'm cheating here a little bit because feature layer is supposed to render null, remember? Like, we don't want actual HTML, but I still want access to slots. And so I'm using template because template doesn't actually render, like, it doesn't show anything on a page. So it's safe to use in a sense because I still have access to children and parent, and the feature layer still can render its children elements without messing up the way it looks. And then I'll use the provide inject API, or the feature, which was introduced in Vue 2. And provide inject is a way of passing props down to children without, or passing state or data down to children without having to do so via props. We didn't use provide inject in the previous example because map is only the map context is only created in the mounted hook. and provide inject provides data before create it or mount it, and so map context will always be null. So in this case, because map context is a property, it can provide it to its children elements. So we'll create our feature pop-up, and we'll inject map context into it, and then the mounted hook will do some stuff. I'm going to talk a little bit about Mapbox here. I know I said I wasn't going to, but I will. So we're going to do an on-click. So it clicks on the specific thing, and then it does some Mapboxy things. But what I want you to focus on is the HTML element piece of it. Mapbox, when it creates a pop-up, expects you to set HTML to that pop-up. And so, in a sense, we have to render non-HTML, but also render HTML, which is a little confusing. And so what we can do is we can create HTML. We can create a Vue instance to create a Vue HTML within a Vue instance, which is what we will do. We'll create a method called createHTML, and then we'll grab some slot data, like for example, if someone puts a paragraph or a span within it. And then we can return a new Vue instance where we can use our render method. I'm using H as a short form for create element. You can also use that. And then I'm just passing it the vnode and the div, or the element, the HTML element that I want it to render as. And this isn't finished yet, because currently the way that the Vue instances is a virtual DOM node. It's not actual HTML. So we need to mount it to an element and then grab the inner HTML of that element so that Mapbox knows how to render that. It's fine. I got this. Ta-da! No, stop. So we have a map, and then we have a view on the map, and then we click on it, and it says, hello, view. Can you see that? No? Can you see it now? Ta-da! So we effectively pass state down. I went a little further with this example, and I have code slides up that I'll show you in a minute, or links to my slide. But I also went one step further and added an extra layer on top of the current layer, which is a layer of neighborhoods in New Orleans. So it gives you context of like the entire New Orleans and Vue in New Orleans. So all in all, go back to Keynote. All in all, Vue affords us the freedom to decide for ourselves how to render things and how to build things. Currently, there isn't really any patterns or anti-patterns to writing Vue yet. And so in a sense, you could use that to your advantage. You could take all the experience that you bring from various frameworks and try to figure out how exactly to translate that. And your knowledge is actually really valuable, because there'll be multiple people who will be in your shoes who will have similar experiences. And so that's how I'd like to end this talk. If you want access to my slides, they're on GitHub. No, my slides are not up. My code is up. And so that's all I have. And you can find me on the interwebs at shortdiv.